I imagine that some of you have had the opportunity to attend an ordination to the priesthood, but that very few of you have attended a solemn profession of monastic vows. And in our Benedictine tradition, the imagery in the ceremony is very striking. It's very powerful. And I can think back 7 years of when I made final vows. And in the ceremony itself, it has a lot of the images and the things that St. Paul said in his letter to the Colossians. Specifically, when St. Paul exhorted us to put to death the parts of you that are earthly, and the taking off of the old self and the putting on of the new self in Christ. At one point in the ceremony, after entrusting his life and call to God, the monk then lies prostrate, face down, on the floor of the church before the altar. And at that point, I can even remember my parents, who weren't quite sold on the idea of monastic life at the time, sitting in the front row, a little bit emotional. It got a whole lot more emotional, because what they do at that point is they cover the monk who's lying prostrate with a funeral pall, the same funeral pall that's used to cover a coffin at a funeral, symbolizing in a very profound way the death to self before the new life in Christ. But to make matters even more powerful, we also toll the bell in the bell tower. One of the monks rings the bell that is only tolled when there's a funeral. So it creates quite a powerful atmosphere. And if we think that even those same images, which we're very privileged to be able to celebrate a baptism this morning, of where in baptism the water symbolizes one's burial in Christ, from which he or she rises by the resurrection with Christ as a new creature. St. Benedict, in his rule for monks, which was written more than 1,500 years ago, he also has this instruction that says to the monk to keep death daily before your eyes. So sometimes when I communicate this to guests, they already see all these monks in black robes walking around. They're a little bit alarmed by all these ideas of death. But it is very much consistent with what we see Jesus, or we hear Jesus talking about in the gospel. It makes perfect sense, because in the parable Jesus communicates, God says to the man, "You fool, this night your life will be demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, to whom will they belong?" So many people in this world, especially in our own country, do not live in fear of God. Many of them are financially successful. They're healthy. They're very comfortable. So they often think, why do I need God? Many people stop having faith in God because they do not see death as something that is close at hand. And we can even think of how many young people, when they go off to college, our culture tells them to experience life, to live a little. And so then they become indoctrinated with many false teachings, and they oftentimes stray from the faith. As a result, they damage that relationship with God. To live consciously, though, of our own mortality helps us to live each day well by keeping God's commandments and realizing that everything, even the gift of our life, is very precious and dear to us, that it comes from God alone. And when we're mindful of the gift that God gives us, and even our own frailty, we're more well aware of how we treat one another, whether we're living a morally upright life. And we realize also the very sobering fact that at the end of our life, we will have to render an account for our deeds. And only us. That's only us, we can do that. Jesus instructs us then to be rich in the matters that pertain to God. And if we start with the end in mind, which for all of us is heaven, then it helps us to examine our life honestly and understand where we need to change. We might even ask ourselves, how faithful am I to the sacraments, especially to the sacrament of reconciliation in the Eucharist? What vices do I need to uproot? And what are the attitudes and behaviors in my life that prevent me from giving my heart totally to Christ? When we meditate upon that final goal of heaven, then it helps us to sanctify our undertakings and see that this life is very important, but we don't know the extent of our time here on earth. God is inviting us to this great gift, this relationship, and calling us to holiness, to be perfect as the Father in heaven is perfect. And we should treasure this gift of new life that He gives us in Christ and seek those things that are above, especially the promised inheritance of heaven. Because when we see things in light of eternity, it gives us a very helpful perspective. And in very practical ways then, we might be able to overcome some of the minor inconveniences that we experience. Those temptations towards greed or being jealous of others. Or even just those disputes and times when we might want to lose our patience and become angry with another. Those matters seem very trivial in light of all eternity. As we celebrate this Eucharist, may we recall our own baptismal promises and how we put to death the old self and its practices and were raised to new life with Christ.